The holidays are almost here and there's magic in the air. I'm going to show you how to make this cute little stocking. Let's go over the supplies. You're going to need a cutting mat. I like my favorite Stripology ruler, a nice cutting ruler, a pressing surface, the pattern for your stocking, this template that we're going to create, a rotary cutter, a stitch in the ditch foot, a 1/4 inch piecing foot, a tape measure, wonder clips, some marking tools, a black pen, lead pencil, and a Sharpie. 2 spools of thread. One's for sewing and the other one's for our template, quilt batting, backing fabric for the stocking, lining fabric, fabric for the cuff, some ultra soft fusible, strips of fabric. Put it all together and we're going to get this cute little stocking. Okay, so we've gone through all the supplies, and what I'm going to tell you is look in the description for some full instructions on how to do this. My stockings that are a full size stocking behind me is not the size that I'm going to make today. I'm going to show you a little alternative. Now, the instructions themselves talk about cutting your strips 2.5 inches wide. For this smaller version, which is much tinier blocks, I've cut my strips 1.5 inches wide. Let's just have a little side note. Scale matters, especially when it comes to sewing projects. If I've got large squares, they're not going to look good on a small project, and too many little tiny pieces, well, it's a little distracting too. So let's talk about how I've got set up. So most of the time, if you're not a big sewer, you're probably looking at this going, all those little squares. Well, there's a trick to doing this, and that is you start with strips. So I've taken a full 45-inch long strip of fabric, which is what's called whip the fabric, and I've cut it in half after cutting a 1.5 inch wide strip. I have it alternated between a full pattern and a little dot, full pattern and a little dot, so on and so forth. I've got 2 different sets set up. I have one that begins with my larger print and one that begins over here with my smaller print. And this is exactly how I have them laid out, and that's exactly how I've got them, and I'm going to sew them together. Let's begin with this set, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a couple little tips along the way about how to make sure that all your strips stay nice and square. So I'm going to start by just laying a print on top of my little dot fabric, and when I start sewing, just know that what I'm going to be doing is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so I've got a foot that helps me do just that. Let's sew. Some fun little efficiencies. When you've sewn a strip together, just go ahead and grab the next 2 pieces of fabric and continue on. This is what we quilters call chain piecing. It makes it easy. So now that I've got all of my sets put together, I still have 1 strip, but I don't want to put that on until I start pressing. This is an important step. So now I'm going to take all of my fabric and set it to the side and pull my iron towards me. And this is going to be a big tip for anybody who's sewing strips of fabric together. One of the things that I've noticed is that it really is critical to make sure that everything stays straight. So I'm going to show you my favorite way of doing this. Now, the first thing that I like to do is make sure that when I'm pressing, that I always have my dark colored fabric on top. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my fabric. I'm not using any steam. This just sets the stitch. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my fabric, and I'm just going to use the weight of the iron, and I'm going to let it push my fabric over to the side. This is pressing it to the dark side. Now the tip is I use a ruler, and once I've done pressing it, see how my fabric looks all wonky? Well, if I keep adding strips to this, that's going to be a big issue because I'm not going to stay square. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and just push my strips right up to that ruler, and now I can set it. And it moved a tiny bit, so I'm just going to test it again. And if I have to, I'll do this. So you don't want to touch the ruler with the iron, but what you do want to do is make sure that you've got a good straight edge. Now I can start combining my sets together, and I'll check it with my ruler along the way. So now that all of my sets are put together, I'm going to add my last strip, and then I'm going to put them all together. I'm ready now to add this set to this piece here. And as I'm putting this together, I hope that you've noticed that the ruler that I'm using is really a way of making sure that my strips stay aligned, and I'm going to really show it to you on this next press. Let me get this stitch first. Okay, a couple things I'm going to point out. Every single time I'm pressing, I'm making sure that my top piece that I just added, this one here, this color, this is facing up. If I had my polka dot or my light color facing up, when I pressed, my seam allowance would be going towards the white, and then there would be show through. Now there's another reason why I'm doing it this way. For consistency, it's when I start nesting in all of my seam allowances together, they're going to look really good. So I'm going to lock that fabric again, lock those stitches. I'm going to move it, my iron this way, and just press that towards the direction of the colored fabric. And again, let's look at what that ruler is really helping me do. So you can even see it as easily using my pressing mat. When I have this sitting here, notice that this edge is even with my pressing mat, but then it comes up and it stays up. That's not what I want. I need it to all be the same. So I can even do it without a ruler as long as you've got a good straight edge. It's just the ruler really helps me, okay? And so now that I've coaxed it down, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push my fabric away, and everything should follow suit. So we can also check it on the opposite end. I'm going to turn my fabric this way. And I'm going to check it here. And if there's any wonkiness or bubbling, this is the time for me to get rid of it. Now, one of the things that happens as you're pressing seam allowances, sometimes things go back in a different direction than you want. We're going to turn this over and take a look at it when it's done and make sure that our seam allowances are where we want them to be. So it's pushing towards the darker color here, both towards the darker color. Same here, and I've got a little piece that wants to go back, and I'm going to make sure that it's going exactly where I want it to go. And now that I've got this set done, let's go ahead and do our next set. This time I'm going to begin with a polka dot, and I'm going to end with a polka dot. Okay, so I've finished my second set, and this one is different from the first set, only in that it is beginning and ending with my polka dot or my light fabric. So now I have a set. They're identical in terms of the fabric. They both have 9, begin and end with the dark fabric, begin and end with the polka dot. Now it's time to just make sure that I've got enough fabric for my pattern. So this is my little pattern that I made. And I'm going to hold this up, and here's what I'm seeing. I'm just one row short of being able to get this. So what I'm going to do, back to the drawing board, I'm going to add one more strip here. I'm going to add one more strip over here. So what that means is that I'm going to have a series that begins with a polka dot and ends with a dark colored fabric, and another one that begins with a dark colored fabric and ends with a polka dot. I'm going to make sure that I'm paying attention to that when I start putting the strips together, but it'll all make sense in a second. So let's sew one more time. Now that ruler trick works really good, especially if you use a little tabletop ironing board, because it doesn't have a good long straight edge. If you've got one of these little wool pressing mats, they're ideal because they've got a good straight edge. Okay, so now that I have my 2 segments done, what I'm going to do now is show you my favorite method for cutting these into perfect 1.5 inch strips. You won't believe your eyes, it goes fast and they are perfect. I've got my piece of fabric and I've got it right up to one of the straight edge lines on here. And that's another reason why it's super important to make sure that your strips are nice and square. Now, this is what I said was one of my favorite rulers. And this is from Gudrun, who is an amazing woman who makes rulers that give you perfect cuts. And the first time I used one of these, I was amazed because it made my sewing so much better, because if you cut well, you sew well. So what I've got is my line right here, the number 2 line, and my fabric is directly on it. And this very first line at 0 is what's going to allow me to cut off the excess that isn't very nice. So this is how we get squared up. So I'm just going to run that in there. And now if you look, every single place that there's a star is exactly 1.5 inches away. Okay, how easy is that? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the stars, and I'm just going to make my cuts. I don't even have to think, which is always a good thing. Okay, we're all cut. Let's look at the magic. It's important to have a very sharp ruler or a cutting knife, so that always helps. So if I've got a little hiccup in it, but see how perfect these are? And what I don't have to do is I don't have to worry about my ruler skewing in one direction or the other, which before this ruler came into my life, that's what was happening to me all the time. So there's absolutely no waste. And okay, if anybody is feeling my pain right now, I feel you too, because this is what happens to me oftentimes. And it might have been a little bit because I was cutting while I was sitting down. So now that I've done this on my first set, I'm going to do it on my second set, and then I'll have all my strips ready to start piecing them together. So now it's time to start putting my strip pieces together, and you'll notice that what I'm going to be doing when I lay them out is making sure that my colored fabric is right next to my polka dot fabric. Now I've got a lot more strips than I really need just to make one little stocking, and that's because I want to make more. So when I start putting these together, what you'll notice is that I'm going to be nestling them. And this is why it was so important for me to press my fabrics in opposite direction, because it really matters. If you look at my stocking here, it really matters that you get all of your points to line up, and the secret is pressing it correctly. Now the foot that I'm using for my machine is a 1/4 inch piecing foot that has a guide, and the little flange that's sticking out on the side, it's kind of like training wheels. It's making sure that I get a perfect 1/4 of an inch every time. So we're just going to just stitch them together. Go a little bit slower on this part, and it's important to do that because I'm feeling where my fabric is nesting in with each other. This is what's going to make sure that when I finish stitching, that it looks really nice and neat. And I do like that my machine has this presser foot pivot system in it, because what it's doing is it's lifting up every single time I stop sewing, which kind of helps make it a little bit easier to get my pieces nestled in. So let's take a look at that. So this is my first row, and just like before, what I like to do is I like to give it a little bit of a press. And I'm not as worried about it squaring up here because it's not going to get too out of sorts with each other. Oh, look at those cute little squares. So cute. Like, I would die if I had to cut this by hand. Thank you, Gudrun, for making such a cool ruler. All right, so see how that is? If I get my little bits of fabric out of the way, see how nice they nestle in? Now that I've done one, I'm going to start working on some more just so that I have enough in order to be able to cover my stocking pattern. Okay, so I've sewn this set together and I'm ready to introduce this set, but I've got a little surprise. It won't work. Look at this. I've got one of my dark fabrics. It's all matching here, and even if I turn it this way, it's all matching. This happens. It really has to do with what's on top when you sew. That's why sometimes I'll say, start with the dark square on top so that it ends up being even each way. No big deal. All I have to do is add one more strip to this set so that I give myself the bridge, right? I just need to have that polka dot here. Then what I'll be able to do is I'll be able to add this. And once I get those together, guess what? I'll have exactly what I need in order to cut out my first stocking. Okay, so now my piece is all put together. I love the way it looks. I'm going to layer my fabrics now. I'm going to be using a piece of quilt batting. You can use any kind that you like, and a nice piece of inside fabric, which is your lining. Let's take a peek at what I've got ready to go. I have my top piece that I've pieced. In between it and the backing, or the lining fabric, I have a piece of quilt batting. And I like to use something called Warm and Natural, and so that's a low loft batting. And now I have, for the opposite side of my stocking, I have my backing, same quilt batting, and also the lining fabric. So what I'm going to do here, and I've started off by putting some pins down the center, I'm simply going to stitch right along these lines in what's called stitching in the ditch. And to do that, I've put a different presser foot on my machine. And this one actually has a little flange that's right down the center. So I get to use that foot to help my machine go exactly where I want it to go. And the other thing I did was I changed my stitch length to be 3 millimeters long. And that's what's going to help me kind of go through here. So let's start stitching. Now, it's customary on something like this to put a walking foot on your machine. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop after every couple inches, let my fabric relax. And you'll notice that with my hands being positioned this way, what I'm doing is I'm just kind of feathering it out to the side. So let's take a look at what I've done. I'm using white thread, and on the back you can see my stitching. It's going down the center of it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it so that I'm actually stitching from the other direction to start with. So this is where I started the first time. I'm going to start on this end, and I'm going to go down the ditch next to the one that I stitched before. Now, the reason I can get away with this is it's really such a small piece. If you really had a big piece of fabric, you absolutely have to use either a digital dual feed, which is a Baby Lock branded thing, or you have to use a walking foot, because otherwise you're going to have a hot mess on your hands. There's some benefits to going small. So I've done everything on one side. I don't care that it's a little bit wonky. Again, it's the inside of my stocking and it's too small. Nobody's ever going to see it. Now let's do the opposite side. Okay, that was pretty fast. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do some similar quilting. This time I've taken the time to take my piece of fabric here and I folded it in half and I pressed a little line, and that's going to be my first row of stitching. Again, I'm just lining that little flange on my foot right on that little pressed mark. Now what I'm going to do, because I don't want to do too many lines on this, I don't want to waste time, I want to put it together. I'm just going to take my fabric and I'm going to have it touch the line that I just stitched. I'm going to finger press that in place, and that's my next stitching line. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now that you have these lines here, it'd be really easy to see where to go in the center of them. I'm going to do that next. I'm just visually lining up my stitching, so I'm going right in between the two. Okay, nothing to it. I'm going to do 2 more rows right down here so that I don't have any edges that are flapping around. Now, if you wanted to get fancy, you could have done this in a diagonal and spent a lot of time on it, but let's get to the fun part. So now I'm going to take my pattern piece, which I have right here, and I'm going to lay it first on top of my stocking. Now, this you have to pay attention to. So I have my stocking going in this direction for the one that I made. If I want them to match, then I'm going to lay this out this way. If I wanted to have 2 stockings that faced each other when they're hanging up, I could put it this way. I'm going to make them the same. So I'm just going to put my pattern on top of this, and what I'm paying attention to is just making sure that everything fits. I'm going to pin it, and then I'll cut it out. I love it when I make projects and there's not a lot of waste. So now all I'm going to do is cut out my back of my stocking. And so remember, this is the outside of my stocking. This is the lining on the inside. The best way to make sure that you have it going in the right direction is to just lay them on top of each other with the lining pieces matching. I'm going to pin this in place, and then I'm going to just cut around it, kind of using what I already cut as my pattern. All right, perfect. Now it's time to stitch them together. So this is a stocking that is already self-lined, which makes it really fast because you're not dealing with a couple different pieces. Now, I know from experience that this can be a problem when I start to stitch them together. So rather than taking any chances, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my 1/4-inch piecing foot back on my machine, and I'm just going to run some thread all the way around the exterior of my stocking just to make sure that everything stays where it's supposed to go. It's a step worth taking. And now I'm going to do the same on the lining piece. Let's put these together. So I'm going to have the outside of my back and the front. I'm going to place them together, and this is where I'm going to use these fun little clips. They're called Wonder Clips. They are wonderful, and I'm just going to find some key places on here to have them go together. Now, I like these, number one, because I have to have things held together, otherwise they'll shift. But what you don't want to do is sew over your pins, like ever. It's like never good for your sewing machine. So I cut these out together so they line up perfectly. Now I'm going to stitch just around this and leave this open. So now when I start stitching around here, I'm going to be following along the stitching that I did when I basted around my stockings. Notice how I back stitched at the beginning, and I'm going to back stitch at the end to make sure that these don't come apart. Right, let's turn it out. Ultra cute. And now we're completely turned out. It's time to make the cuff. And so just relax and watch me. And so the first thing I'm going to start with is an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And what I did with this sheet of paper is I first measured up 1 inch from the bottom and drew myself a nice straight line. My cuff itself, I'm actually going to cut a strip of fabric that's 4 inches deep. But having that 1 inch here allows me extra fabric so that I can go ahead and do some stitching. I like that scallop detail. The next thing I'm going to do is create my scallops. Well, how did I do that? Well, this is how I did it. I took my little tape measure and my large spool of thread, and what I did was I measured from one side over to the other just about exactly 1.5 inches. And what I did was I used my Sharpie and I did a little dot on either end. What that does is it gives me a registration mark so that I'm going to take my pen. I first blocked off 1/4 inch for a seam allowance, and then starting with this point here and matching it up on the other side, I drew a scallop. And then I just kept moving down until I got exactly 8 scallops. Now what this does, just watch, when I fold this in half like this and match it up to my stocking, okay, it's exact. And so that's what we're looking for. Now the pattern that you download that's a part of this description, it actually gives you all the dimensions for the larger size stocking. But if you end up making your own, just remember that your finished size across needs to be able to work as a halfway mark here, okay? The math is easy, just let your head kind of think about it a little bit. So once I've done that, what I'm going to do, remember this is my ultra soft stabilizer. I cut this into a 4-inch strip. One side of it is shiny, and that's the fusible side. What I did was I took a piece of my fabric, cut 4 inches deep, and I fused that to the back of my strip. And so now this has got some stabilization to it, and it gives it a little bit of body. Just exactly what I need for my cuff. The next thing I did is I cut a 4-inch deep piece of my white fabric, and this time I laid it on top of my template, and what I did was I just gave myself a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this side, so I just kind of started a little bit farther over, and I went all the way over to this side and I drew myself an extra 1/2 inch seam allowance on that side. So what this is going to do is these are actually my stitching lines. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to place this piece of fabric with my drawn lines on top of my other piece of fabric with right sides together. So this is the wrong side because I've got writing on it. This is the right side because you can't see the writing through it, but I can see the lines that I'm going to be stitching on, and it's on top of my fusible piece. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to use some of my fancy Wonder Clips again, and I'm just going to clip this on here. And I'm just going to make sure that my edges meet, and I can even cut off my excess. I can clean it up and make it exact once I finish stitching. So now when I get to stitching, I'm going to go back to my standard presser foot for my machine. And I've got my machine in the center needle position, but remember how I made my stitch length a little bit longer for when I was doing the quilting? This time, I'm going to make it a little bit shorter than normal. I'm making it 1.8 millimeters. If your machine doesn't go exactly to that, it's okay to go to 2 millimeters, but I'm looking for a nice tiny stitch length for myself, because what's going to happen is I'm going to use these stitches and, well, you'll see. Let's go. So do you notice how I use my hand to pivot? I'm not pulling on my fabric. And if I find that my speed of my machine is getting out of control, stop and raise your presser foot. If it doesn't lift up automatically for you like mine does for me, okay, I'm spoiled, I get it. But what you want to do is just raise it up yourself manually and then just keep sewing. Now what I'm going to do when I get to the point, and I can see that I'm right at the point here, I'm going to have my fabric facing me so it's square to me. And the thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take one stitch. Now on my machine, all I have to do is tap the presser foot. It takes one stitch, and now I'm ready to start going in the other direction. Notice how I've pivoted my fabric. So now I'm just going to start stitching on this. Now sometimes it's a little bit easier if you've got a little bit of a clear foot. So if you find that you can't really see well, but if you notice on my machine, I've got a tiny little notch here, and that's what I'm looking. What you want to be looking for is lining your fabric up with that notch. Don't try to watch your needle. It'll make you crazy. So I'm here again, putting my fabric so that it's facing me. Tap on the presser foot one time. It makes a little stitch that direction, and I'll just keep going. Okay, so it's a little bit tedious, but it's worth it because the scallops are so cute. Now let's look at what I did. So if you look up really close, you're going to notice that my stitching isn't exactly perfect. Nobody's going to care. What you really did still get is a nice little scallop. So now you just need a really nice sharp pair of scissors, and let's trim around it. I'm going to trim getting right about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I want to get kind of tight. Now the reason why I had my machine take one stitch forward is that I'm going to cut all the way to that stitch. You don't want to cut through the stitch. You just want to get all the way up to it. Now I'm going to make sure that I got up to those points. And now we're going to open this up and press our scallops. Now the way to do this best is to just use your finger and push it and do every single one of them. And then we'll take it to our iron. You can use something round like this. Just make sure that the cap is on. Household tools for sewing. I do it all the time. Actually, chopsticks are great. Look at how pointy that is. That would actually be cute. Now that we're finished pressing this in place, what we're going to do now is I'm going to top stitch close to this edge here. It is worth the extra step. Now I'm going to keep my standard presser foot on, but I want to make sure that I put my stitch length back to 2.5. Okay, so top stitching is done here. And the next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to get my little loop ready for hanging. So this loop actually goes in between the cuff and the actual stocking itself. And that needs to go on next before I apply the cuff. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking one of my strips, just a little piece that I had left over, use any fabric that you like, and this is really just going to be simply a matter of turning in the raw edges of the long piece. And I'll cut it to size once I'm done, but it's kind of easier to work with a larger piece than you need. And I'm just basically mentally having this go right to the center here, so it's just dividing it in half. I like to have a diminutive little loop. I don't want it to be really chunky because this is kind of a tiny little thing. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this onto itself. And so you've got enclosed edges. There's nothing raw. And what I'm going to do now is that it's finished. I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm just going to stitch this open and closed. All right, so there you go. That was easy. And now all I do, here's my scientific way. Just fold it in half and cut it off to the length that you like. I think I want it to be probably about this long. And remember, you're going to lose some of the length in your seam allowance. So I'm good with this. We'll cut it off. And this is what's going to kind of freak you out. It doesn't go on the outside. You're probably thinking, oh, I know where that goes. No, you don't. Right now. The reason why I know you don't know is because I've put them on the wrong way so many times. Well, at least 4. So I'm going to tuck this on the inside, and you can open up all this bulk here and just kind of tuck it there. Now, this is going to be hanging like this, and this is my only rule. I just don't like to see raw edges. So what I'm going to do is make sure that when this is up, it's like this. So that means that I'm going to point that seam to the back. So again, putting it here, raw edges match. It's the extra step, but just do this, please. If you don't, you'll be mad at yourself. And I'm going to stitch it from inside so I can see what I'm doing. That kind of held it in place for me. I want it to stick. So I go a few times. So now that that's here, if you wanted, all you have to do at this point is fold this together, seam it together, and then we put the cuff on. But I like embroidery. So I'm going to add a little embroidery to the top. It'll be easy. Just watch the magic. Magic! Let's put some embroidery on my cuff. So in order to get placement, for those of you who might have an embroidery machine as well, this is my seam here. And remember, it's going on my stocking like this. So this is the area that I want to relegate for embroidery. And I don't want to go past the center mark. So I'm going to do a little finger press here. And then, because I really would like not to embroider through all the layers, I can see my crease. I've got a piece of sticky paper here. This is a stick tear away from Baby Lock, and I'm just going to stick that on here. And the cool thing is guess what? It doesn't go anywhere. This is going to stay on here, and now I'm going to put my hoop on my machine. So my embroidery machine has some pretty nice fonts, but there's one that I like really better, and it's this one. It's a gingerbread font from Designs by Juju, and I've preloaded my USB with some fun designs, and I picked that one. And that's what I'm going to embroider. Now, I have to do a couple little things. What I have to do is first rotate my design so it's going in the right direction. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that my design kind of is landing where I want it to go. And this is where I do a little bit of a thread trace. So I'm going to have my machine so I can kind of see where it's going to go. Looks to me like that's probably a good spot. And all I'm going to do is close this and then lower my presser foot and start embroidering. That was fast touch and I like it. So let's remove the embroidery frame, tear it off the back. And now let's go back to doing sewing. And so what I'm going to be doing next is I'm going to take and sew this together in one piece. I have to do a little switcheroo here. Okay, let's sew this up. Should have backstitched. Okay, so now that I've got my little cuff completely done, what I'm going to do is, just like I did before with the stocking itself, I'm going to stitch this in place because I really want this to move as one unit, and it's pretty easy to do. I'm just going to take my fabric and put it inside here and then just stitch around. Now what I like to do is open up this seam allowance because I gave myself a 1/2 inch and it's a little bit bulky if I don't do it that way. Okay. Okay, so this is the part that I always have to look at my own instructions, but I just did a refresh. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this name and we're going to tuck it in just like this. So it doesn't seem right, and I know it, but you have to trust me on this one. So we're going to tuck it in that way, and again, I'm going to use my little clips. And if you have to, just give it a little snug. Now we're going to stitch around the top one more time. And again, I'm doing this from inside because it just makes it easier to navigate. Now if you do the larger size stocking, it's easier if you just turn your machine into a free arm machine, meaning you take the embroidery unit off and the accessory tray and all that business. And that way then you can just kind of put the whole thing around the arm of your machine. And just like that, you're all the way around. And now for the reveal. And there you go. Isn't she cute? After you've cleaned up a few threads, your project is finished, and isn't it adorable? For more inspiration and projects like these, be sure to check out babylock.com and check below in the description in order to be able to find all of the dimensions for the projects that you can create one of your own. See you again soon.